So, welcome everyone. I'm Alexander Mihalcea, and today we have one of the industry leaders, David Sturmes, Chief Sales Officer of Mwamba and co-founder and director of the Impact Facility. Welcome, David. How are you doing today?
Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me. Really excited to talk to you.
Awesome, and I'm excited to have you on the podcast today, and I'm sure you're going to be of great value for the audience. Now, before we dive in, could you give us a quick background of you?
Great. I have been working in the nonprofit sector for the last 8 years and recently transitioned into this new role with Mwamba. But for the longest time, I've been working with the Impact Facility, a nonprofit that has been set up specifically to engage with artisanal mining communities and mining communities at large to ensure that they benefit from mineral exploitation around their vicinity, and have now moved role to join the Mwamba Mining team as Chief Sourcing Officer and continue to support the impact facility on the side.
Okay, that's fascinating. And basically, in your opinion, what are the biggest barriers to financial inclusion in Africa today?
Yeah. So my experience is very much linked to looking at SMEs, small medium-sized enterprises in the mining sector, and then largely working across East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, but also Congo. And if we look at those countries, and I think some of those learnings can be generalized across the continent, access to formal financing is very limited. And that is partially linked to the informality of the sector, and a lot of sectors are informal, but also the risk profile of the sector and the perceptions that exist around it. And main challenges there really are, to some extent, a lack of financial literacy by a lot of the entrepreneurs seeking financing, which means that without a clear business plan and clear understanding of how those investments would positively impact the productivity and profitability, banks have a difficult time of assessing the credit worthiness of them, but also the lack of collateral, which holds many small-scale miners and small, medium-sized enterprises in general back when it comes to accessing formal financing. What we see then is that many are still successful in getting financing through informal channels, but the conditions under which they agree to these or the terms they're being offered are often quite exploitative compared to what a commercial bank would be able to offer. And that is not necessarily out of bad faith from the people that are financing them. It's a high risk, high reward engagement. And so
Okay.
often interest rates can be higher than 100% a year, which is 5 times the going commercial rate of about 16 to 19% that is standard in East Africa.
Yeah.
And so looking at this from both sides, from a financial inclusion perspective, so from a banking perspective to potential clients, it's about understanding the sectors that they are looking to engage with, building risk matrices that accommodate informality and work with continuous improvement. And from a client's perspective, trying to access financing, it's all about starting to learn the vocabulary,
Yeah.
understanding how to frame the business propositions. And that starts with bookkeeping, doing a basic profit and loss, and then ultimately being able to articulate a business plan that investors can review and critique.
Right. But for example, how can blended finance models help bridge the funding gap for SMEs in Africa?
So blended finance is a nice way for informal or high risk sectors to be approached by formal financial institutions. And in essence, blended finance means that commercial financing is mixed with grant or impact financing. And that could either be to um, protect against first loss risk. So if we're thinking that the default risk is a bit higher with a certain industry group or a set of people, then a non-profit organization or a donor or an impact investor can come in and say, we are happy to cover the first 10, 20, 30% of defaults, depending on what it is that is being negotiated. And what that allows the bank to do is to keep the interest rates commercially competitive, because they don't have to price in all that risk, and they can share the risk with people that provide some of the grant financing.
Yeah.
But it's not only about first loss positions. Sometimes you also see structures in which the grant is being used for technical support. So you can de-risk the investments by saying there's a grant portion alongside the investment financing, the loan or asset financing that you're providing. And either through a for-profit entity or a non-profit entity, we can provide training. If it's farming, for better farming practices, better irrigation, better post-harvest management. If it's mining, we're talking about better health and safety, regulatory compliance, better resource development and scoping. And so using a grant portion to de-risk helps. And then the idea behind this is that this is a temporary measure. There might be a few years, but as banks understand better when to engage or how to structure products, how to factor in the risks that they see into the pricing and into the terms that they're providing, they can wean themselves off from those guarantees. So the guarantees are a nice segue, a bridge for them to start engaging, but ultimately they need to see business viability. If they don't see long-term viability, blended finance is not going to help
Yeah, makes sense.
increase long-term access to commercial financing.
And for example, what role can commercial banks play in promoting financial inclusion and supporting the SMEs sector?
So commercial banks, I'd be talking about domestic banks, so banks on the continent, they are closest to the ground, and they have offices already in the different towns and cities and villages. A lot of them have online banking and mobile banking applications. But if we're looking at mining specifically, or the informal artisanal small-scale mining sector that I've been working on for the last 8 years,
Yeah.
they lack the understanding, the technical understanding of knowing where to engage, how to structure deals. So what banks can do right now is proactive outreach to start banking first. So it's not immediately offering loans or equipment financing, but it starts with a banking first mentality. So onboarding them to their mobile payment systems, offering them bank accounts, and then investing into that outreach. And then developing a relationship with individuals or the companies where they start depositing money, they start using digital transfers, and over time, as you build trust through having an ongoing relationship, you can then start trying out smaller amount loans, and then graduate into bigger loans over time.
Upselling,
And we've
basically.
seen quite a lot of interest from commercial banks, especially around the mining sector, trying to get into this. I've been working on gold mining for a long time, and this is a high value commodity. So we're talking about large amounts of money, also linked to a lot of costs. But a high value commodity means large transactions and a lot of potential engagements for inventory financing, for trade financing, for operation financing or equipment provision. And so we've seen growing interest from banks to understand and then enter this market.
Yeah, yeah, I see. And now let's go back to when you first started with this, because I think this is very interesting. And for example, what are the key challenges and opportunities in the African mining sector?
So when we talk about mining, we need to differentiate between industrial mines. So these would be mines that are run by large, often international companies, which are subject to regulatory compliance checks, often participate in voluntary certifications, starting with ISO certifications for environmental management systems, but going to more niche certifications that are specific to the minerals they're producing. And challenges around those are distinct and different, and I'll touch on them compared to the second pillar of the mining industry, and that's what's called the artisanal and small scale mining industry.
Yeah,
And artisanal is something that most people might not connected to mining initially. It's more something that we use in everyday use for artisans that make jewelry or
Yeah.
craftsmen of different sorts. But it's basically synonymous to subsistence mining. So people that are mining with very limited means, often highly improvised, often informal, but in different African countries, they do enjoy legal recognition, and in some others, they're considered illegal. But these miners are, for some minerals, responsible for the majority of minerals that are being produced. Examples of that would be colored gemstones. Often more than half of colored gemstones come from artisanal and small-scale miners. Gold is being mined up to 20% globally, and around 40% in Africa through artisanal small-scale mining. And then copper and cobalt, which is largely located in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we're talking about 5 to 10% of global supply that comes from artisanal small-scale miners. So if we're looking at all those different minerals, and I haven't named all of them, we talk about more than 40 to 50 million people that are working in this sector. So artisanal small-scale mining, or ASM, as it's often referred to, is the second largest livelihood provider in Africa, second only to agriculture. And if we're looking at the challenges that are linked to the ASM sector, a lot of them stem from the informality. So without government effectively regulating health and safety standards and environmental standards, we see a lot of hazardous working conditions, which stem from the ad hoc, makeshift nature of these mine sites, but also reports of child labor, because a lot of miners are mining out of desperation. So we talk about poverty-driven or artisanal mining in some instances. And if you've read mainstream media, you would have come across reports of child labor in the cobalt mining sector, also in some parts in the gold industry, or in the diamond sector. That's where the Blood Diamonds movie came out, maybe now 15 years ago. And so there's some social concerns around artisanal small-scale mining if it's done without support and without government involvement.
Yeah.
And depending on what mineral is being mined, there's different environmental impacts to factor in. So sometimes there could be deforestation, people cutting down forests to get to the ore bodies. In the case of gold, it is the use of mercury in processing. Mercury is a toxic neurochemical, or a neurotoxin that has almost immediate impact on human health, but is very difficult to get out of the ecosystem once it reaches water bodies, and so it pollutes water for animals and communities alike,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
is a huge issue. And so the artisanal small scale gold mining sector is the biggest emitter of mercury, and that is again driven by the fact that they don't have access to investment that would allow them to upgrade their production methods and start using more advanced machinery that could keep them safer during the point of extraction, but also throughout processing. Before I go into industrial mining and the challenges that are linked to the industrial mining sector, I just really want to emphasize that despite all of those potential difficulties, artisanal small-scale mining is a hugely important livelihood to, as I said, 40 to 50 million people. And so rather than trying to fade out this sector and find alternatives for them to do something else, it is a question of professionalizing the sector, moving from artisanal, which is really at this lowest end of the spectrum in terms of mechanization and health and safety controls, government involvement, to regulated small-scale mining, where we could still have a large workforce, slightly smaller than if it was done purely manual, but we're creating safe and dignified jobs where the men and women that work in this sector are able to generate wealth for themselves and for their communities. And then obviously a small-scale mine would need to adhere to environmental standards, follow good practice for health and safety, and not allow any children into their mining operations. But that's what we've been advocating for, and then I've been advocating for the last 8 years.
Yeah, right, right.
Any questions on that, or should I touch on the industrial mining
Yeah,
next?
yeah, everything clear.
Perfect. So with industrial mining, um, and here we need to recognize that Africa is a tapestry of different countries with different regulatory frameworks, different levels of government engagement and maturity of the mining sector. So I cannot make a blanket statement across challenges that would be everywhere, but I'd probably group it into three or four different categories. One is, again, employment. So potential challenges around industrial mining would be a lack of local hiring for especially the advanced jobs that are on offer. And then that is purely because in very remote and rural areas, you might not have the existing expertise for mining engineering or processing. And so you're looking within the country or the region or sometimes internationally to recruit talent. But ideally, industrial miners optimize for local hiring throughout all parts of the staff hierarchy, from top management all the way to the people that drive the trucks and work on the ground or might be involved in running the villages or accommodation that is being provided to the teams. And I can say from my experience that there's a lot of focus on this. So local hiring and local content. Local content describes the concept that you're starting sourcing goods and services as much as possible from the community that's hosting you and the region where you're operating is a big priority for most mining companies. Then, environmentally speaking, a lot of challenges come around mine closure. So at the end of a mining life cycle, when the mineral ore body has been exhausted, the mine should be returned to its original state, and often that doesn't happen. So there's a lot of legacy issues of mines that have been run in the past that have not been rehabilitated, and that can lead to long-term pollution or hazards and in general,
Interesting.
inability to utilize this land again. And if that was a forested area, you would expect reforestation of that area or just a renaturalization of the area and ensuring that it's not a hazard to the community after. And as you're mining, you're taking material from underground and you're processing it and you're extracting the minerals, but you're still left with everything that wasn't the mineral.
Yeah.
And that waste material is called tailings in the mining industry. And so tailings storage needs to be well constructed. Usually you have tailings ponds, so large artificial lakes basically, where the tailings material can be stored safely. But you might have seen that, whether it's in Brazil or in other places in Africa, sometimes these tailing dams break. And because of the amount of water and slurry that they hold,
Yeah.
that's a huge hazard to communities living around that, and obviously the environment at large. And so tailings management is another key challenge that is linked to especially industrial mining facilities. And then more on the meta level, one of the challenges or areas to get right, rather, would be around tax revenue. These people are employing, best case scenario, they're hiring local people, they're employing, paying a fair wage, sourcing goods and services from local entrepreneurs, and that's all fantastic, and that's already contributing to the economic uplift that mining can accomplish. But they're ultimately paying taxes to the government, usually through the form of royalties, but then also other corporate taxes that you are eligible
Yeah.
for. And there's a question around tax governance. How does the government then start utilizing these funds to build long-term prosperity for the nations where the mining is happening? And unfortunately, linked to mining, especially gold and diamonds, there's a well-documented phenomenon which is called the resource curse that shows that in many weak regulatory environments, extensive mining often leads to more corruption and opaque mismanagement of funds. And so, despite their mineral wealth, a lot of mining communities find themselves still impoverished at the end of the mining cycle. And there's a lot of organizations that work to bring more transparency to this. The biggest one might be the EITI, the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative, that asks for clear disclosure of tax payments, make sure that the right amounts are being paid, but then also putting pressure on governments to ensure a reinvestment of those funds. If we're looking globally, and that's then in the oil and gas sector rather than the mining sector, Norway is usually the best in class example of taking revenue from the extractives industry and putting it into a sovereign wealth fund. And Norway has been a big producer of oil for many decades. They've been able to take the profits from that to invest into renewable energy, invest into innovative startups, and then build a huge government-held sovereign wealth fund on the back of that
Yeah.
limited period opportunity that extractives provide to build lasting wealth for the nation. And there's other countries, I'm sure, that have done similar work, but Norway is the one that I usually use as an example. And so I'd frame all of these as challenges. Mining isn't inherently bad. Mining is inherently needed. If we can't grow it on a plantation, we have to mine it. That's how it works.
Yeah, right.
And so it's a question, how do you do it responsibly? It can never be sustainable because by definition we're extracting a finite ore resource and turning it into minerals. But how can we make sure that the positive impact that mining brings is as permanent and lasting as possible, and that any negative potential impacts are being mitigated, and if they do occur, being remediated, ensuring that the people that are most affected by mining are also the ones that benefit the most.
Yeah, okay. And for example, what are the ethical concerns surrounding all the sourcing of cobalt, gold, and other minerals from the Congo, for example?
Great. So let me start with cobalt mining, because that has made quite its rounds in mainstream media, and here it's the association with child labor. Unfortunately, we estimate that there's between 1 and 5,000 children currently working in the cobalt sector. Many of them are youth, so children aged 14 to 18. Some of them might be younger than that. And the reason why children work is often different based on how old they are. What we observe with younger children could be 6, 7 years old. It's often that they accompany either an older sibling or usually their mother to work. So if the mother happens to work in mining, it would be common to bring the child along to the mine sites. And that's because there's not a centralized offering for childcare, which we might find in other countries. And then since it's not the highest paying jobs, they cannot afford to outsource the childcare to somebody else. That means if we're trying to address that kind of child labor, we need to take other measures than if it's youth that works for different reasons that I'll touch on in a second. But here, really, the idea would be to start organizing women miners, offering childcare services, either through a non-profit organization that is able to put ground financing to it, or working with the cooperatives that are responsible for those mines to build it into their business case. If we're looking at youth, so the people that are slightly older, maybe 14 and above, they often come to really contribute either to their individual or to their household incomes. Some of them might no longer live with their family. Some of them might have left home already, or in some instances, they might be orphaned. But usually they have a family that they live with and they contribute to the income. And that could sometimes also be in order to go to school. So I've met youth that is working and paying for their own school fees and the school fees of their siblings by going to work. And school is usually in blocks of 4 to 5 hours. So if they have an afternoon block and they only go to school from 1 to 6, for example, then they might end up working throughout the morning hours.
Right.
And interesting or important to contextualize is that child labor isn't unique to the mining sector in this region. Berkeley University has done a study, which was published, I think now 7 years ago, 2018, by the SIGA Institute under Berkeley University. There they actually talked to hundreds of households and tried to understand if children are working and why they're working.
Yeah.
And when they did this mapping, they found that about 11% of children in the region that have to work are working in the mining sector, but 89% of child labor occurs outside the mining sector. We are particularly concerned about child labor in the mining sector because it is more hazardous than most other activities, and it links to the products that we are consuming globally, because the cobalt is being processed into usually batteries and then powers our phones, our EVs, our energy storage.
Yeah.
But as we think about how to solve this, it's not as easy as sending children away, but it's trying to understand what brought them to the mine to begin with, and then
Exactly.
engaging in what we call child labor remediation. And this is a task where we, at the Fair Cobalt Alliance, partner with local civil society actors that have trained social workers on staff, and they continue to follow up with these children. They provide emotional and psychological support. Through the child labor remediation system, it's possible to cover their school fees, to pay for books or school uniforms that are also often an obstacle for school attendance, and where necessary, provide housing or healthcare support or psychological support if they've been severely traumatized in the past. But that's important. So it's not as easy as sending children away. If our concern around ethical mining or ethical smartphones, ethical cars is that we don't want children to suffer, we should take the step to remedy the situation and trying to mitigate other children from having to work in the future,
Yeah.
and help those children that work today to get out of child labor at large.
Yeah. Yeah. And now, looking at the broader industry, how can Africa transition away from fossil fuels towards more sustainable energy sources?
Yeah. Obviously linked through the use of minerals, we are moving from a fossil fuel based to mineral based economy. What I mean with that is that we are phasing out oil and gas to adopt solar, wind, hydro energy, battery based storage systems, windmills, all of which need to be made from minerals as well. So, what we see is that there is a global drive to get more critical minerals out of the ground. So critical minerals is a term that is used to describe battery minerals and some other minerals that are important for the energy transition and from a national defense perspective. And a lot of those critical minerals or battery minerals can be found in Africa, sometimes almost exclusively. Cobalt is being mined. 76% of cobalt that circulates in the world every year comes from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. So some of them are highly concentrated in Africa. Others might be spread throughout the globe, but we need so much more of these minerals. That's nickel, lithium, manganese, the three T's, tin, tungsten, tantalum, and then obviously also cobalt, and there's a list of 30 of them, many of which can be found in Africa. And so Africa finds itself in a position where people from the US, from Europe, from China are looking to start or increase the sourcing from the African continent. And meanwhile, almost half of the African population doesn't have access to grid electricity yet. And so they're exporting the minerals that enable us to switch from our existing carbon-based economy to a green economy, while not necessarily being able to prioritize electrifying the continent itself.
Yeah.
And Africa is, in terms of population, the fastest growing continent on the globe. And so it should be a
Right.
priority and is a priority for many heads of state to see how can the energy transition be just and inclusive? How can we make sure that as we support the world in meeting their energy needs through more sustainable ways, that the African continent is being electrified in the process.
Right. Right.
And part of that question evolves around value addition. How much value can be added on the African continent? Can we make solar panels or batteries in Africa and then choose to sell the finished products either within Africa or outside the continent to people that are paying a fair price? And that's a really important discussion because it's a discussion about creating jobs. It's a discussion about sovereignty. It's a discussion about disrupting some of the neo-colonial dynamics that exist when we are exporting concentrates or ore from Africa to meet the needs of the West or Asia. But it's also a very difficult or complex discussion because it has taken China decades to get to the point where they are today in terms of sophistication of their battery industry. And they are a front runner when it comes to infrastructure, so the number of factories and the amounts of material that they can process and transform, but also IP. They've done so much research and development into the right technologies that it's really challenging to enter as a competitor to this. But generally speaking, the positive impact that the electrification of Africa would have on health and on general health, on life expectancy, on economic productivity is huge and cannot be overstated. And so a key priority needs to be just to figure out how the African Union and individual governments can partner up and work together to make batteries built in Africa and solar panels built in Africa a reality. But more importantly, have a clear and consistent plan on how to invest into the adoption of these green technologies and electrify as much of Africa as possible.
Right, and you have right. But for example, I have a curiosity about this. So, how can we address the health problems caused by mining and promote a more sustainable and equitable future for the mining communities?
So when we look at health issues, I would differentiate between within the face and outside within the fence and outside the fence. And that means with people that are directly exposed to the mining activities itself and people that are impacted indirectly. For anybody working inside a mine, whether it's industrial or artisanal, small scale, it's important that they are properly trained, that they have access to the right personal protective equipment, that the infrastructure is safe for them to use. Key issues here, especially on the small scale mining end of the spectrum, are ventilation, having proper ventilation, irrespective of how deep the tunnels are, and water management, because they're serious health threat to the people that work. And then also thinking about noise pollution and exposure to chemicals that might be used during the processing of the material, to ensure that a hazardous job by nature
Yeah.
is being made as safe as possible. And a big part of that is infrastructure, but a just as important part is culture. Safety
Mm.
culture needs to be trained and adopted and practiced every day. Because if you're working in a mine, if you make a mistake or if you're negligent in what you're doing, you're not only putting your own life at risk, you're putting everybody else's life at risk at the
Yeah.
same time. And so that's an important part there. And there's a lot of good frameworks that exist. There's a lot of great examples in the industrial mining sector around what health and safety should look like. And where it was common, maybe 50 or 100 years ago in Europe and North America, for coal mining and other mining activities to be considered highly dangerous and often deadly. It is now an exception if people are actually getting seriously injured or die in industrial mining operations.
Yeah.
And that's great. So preserving human life needs to be the number one priority of the industry. If we're
Exactly.
looking at the impact that it has on the community, it links back to some of the things I've mentioned earlier. It's ensuring that water is not being polluted. And then on the positive side, that mining companies are able to provide water to communities and access to clean, reliable water. It's dust. A lot of ore is being transported by road. And so there's a lot of dust and then a lot of dust exposure, which has long-term chronic impacts on the community, and that needs to be managed. And yeah, it's the reclamation of land and the mine closure to ensure
Yeah.
that long-term there's no risk to the communities after mining activities conclude.
Right. And as you wrap up, what's next for Mwamba? Any exciting developments on the horizon?
So let me quickly introduce Mwamba to give a bit of context. Mwamba is a mining, exploration, and processing company that saw a huge opportunity in working with the artisanal small-scale mining sector. So while most industrial miners or formal mining companies are struggling to or avoid engaging with our artisanal miners, we saw a win-win opportunity to ensure that the people mining artisanally in Tanzania, where Mwamba's first processing plant is located, get access to the right technical expertise, to the financing that they need, and proper processing in order to get maximum value out of those mines for the communities and for anybody that's engaged in those business transactions. And so the beauty of the system is that Mwamba is partnering with existing license holders and existing artisanal mines on a sliding spectrum of different levels of engagement. At a minimum, we can purchase their ore and process it without the use of mercury through a semi-industrial plant, which uses cyanide, which is the way that most industrial miners are processing their gold. And that means that the miners no longer have to worry about crushing and then using mercury and being
Yeah.
very inefficient in what they're doing, but they can focus on the extraction of material, and then we can test the material and we pay them for the gold that's contained in their ore. But then with this, we recognize that we haven't yet addressed all of the issues that are linked to the extraction. And then so we're providing technical support to make sure that they follow health and safety practices. We support with the provision of equipment for a fee. We can help them with exploration, drilling, to make sure that they know where to look for gold and are as efficient and profitable in their endeavors as possible. And in some instances, we're being approached to take over the mining operations. And in those cases, Mwamba runs those mines in partnership with the license holders. Everybody that works at the mine is being put on payroll. Usually they don't get a wage. They wouldn't get a monthly salary. Most artisanal mines, people get a cut of the ore. That means if they find a lot of gold, they get a bit more. If they find very little gold,
Yeah.
they get less money. When we take on the responsibilities for the joint venture mines, everybody's being put on a salary. And then in addition to that, there's a revenue sharing bonus system where if more gold is being produced, they also benefit from that. So they get the best of both worlds. They have a reliable living income and a bonus structure on top of that. And we've been able to connect these mines to our processing plant and then process the gold without the use of mercury, following best practices for the use of cyanide. And we're able to trace the material from the mines to the processing plant and onto the next buyer. So what we've been able to build so far is a fully traceable, responsibly sourced, responsibly mined gold supply chain that includes the communities at the center of the business model rather than trying to work around them. And we're very excited about the recognition that we've recently received by the World Gold Council, which is the leading industry body for the gold industry,
Yeah.
pointing at Mwamba as the first or pioneering model for a processing-led ASM formalization model and encouraging industry to follow in our footsteps. And so as Chief Sourcing Officer, I'll be helping to codify and standardize some of these practices that I've explained. And then we're looking to scale, both within Tanzania, but also to other countries in the coming years, to see if we can replicate the success we're seeing in Tanzania, in Western Africa, maybe in Central Africa, and maybe across other commodities. But it's really a rethinking not seeing artisan small scale mining as a risk inherently, but as an opportunity that has been misunderstood and
Mm.
overlooked by
Yeah.
most of industry, and that is really eager to engage with partners that are able to provide strong technical capacity and appropriate financing to ensure that they pivot from artisanal to professionally run small scale mining operations.
Yeah, sounds great, and a lot of plans on the horizon.
Yeah.
And for listeners who want to learn more or potentially work with Mwamba, what's the best way to get in touch?
So you can find Mwamba on LinkedIn, and we'll be becoming a lot more regular and posting about Mwamba's work there. Also, if you're interested in the work around cobalt and financial inclusion that we've discussed earlier on, I'd encourage to follow the Impact Facility and the Fair Cobalt Alliance. And if we can add the links in the show notes, I'll send them over to you so that they're very easy to find.
Yeah, no problem. Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing those insights about you, about the company, and about the whole story. And thank you for this amazing podcast session.
Thanks, Alex. My pleasure.
Yeah, see you in the next episode.